I had no idea that the most ruthless man in New York, the billionaire CEO who held my entire future in his hands, was standing quietly in the shadows of the archive room, listening to my heart shatter over a 2-minute phone call. If you love dramatic, slow-burn boy love office romances that will keep you completely hooked from start to finish, make sure to hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and let me know in the comments what you think will happen next. Your support helps bring more of these thrilling stories to life. Now, let's dive into the story. Part 1. The Shadows of the 40th Floor. It was supposed to be a Tuesday like any other. The kind of Tuesday that blurred into the endless stream of corporate monotony at Vance Enterprises. My name is Liam Brooks, and for the past year and a half, my entire existence had been defined by spreadsheets, endless cups of black coffee, and anticipating the impossible demands of the most intimidating man in the financial district. I was standing in the dimly lit, temperature-controlled archive room on the 40th floor. The air in there always smelled faintly of old paper, binding glue, and the sterile chill of the air conditioning. I had been sent to retrieve a physical copy of a merger contract from 5 years ago, a task that required silence and focus. But the heavy, suffocating silence of the room was suddenly shattered by the aggressive vibration of my phone against the wooden shelf. I glanced at the screen. Julian. A soft, relieved smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. Julian and I had been together for 2 years. Lately, things had been strained. I was working 80-hour weeks, and he was a freelance photographer who valued spontaneity above all else. I thought he was calling to apologize for the argument we had the night before, or maybe to suggest a late dinner. I swiped right and pressed the phone to my ear, my voice dropping to a hushed, affectionate whisper. "Hey, Jules," I said, leaning my forehead against the cool metal of the filing cabinet. "I'm buried in the archives right now, but I can take a quick break." "What's up?" There was a long, hollow pause on the other end of the line. The kind of silence that immediately makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. "Liam," Julian's voice finally came through. It wasn't warm. It wasn't angry either. It was completely, devastatingly flat. "We need to talk." My stomach performed a sickening plummet. Everyone knows what those 4 words mean. It's the universal preamble to destruction. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though my fingers immediately tightened around the edge of the filing drawer. "Talk about what? Did something happen?" "I can't do this anymore," he said, the words rushing out of him as if he had rehearsed them 100 times and just wanted to get it over with. "Us. This whole dynamic. It's suffocating me, Liam." I felt the blood drain from my face. My breath caught in my throat, trapping a sudden, desperate panic. "Suffocating? Julian, I know I've been working late, but this quarter is almost over. I promised we'd take that trip to upstate New York next month." "It's not about the trip," Julian interrupted, his tone laced with a sudden, cruel irritation. "It's about you. Look at you. You're hiding in an archive room taking my call. You live your life on a schedule, Liam. You're stiff. You're cold. You're obsessed with a job where you are nothing but a glorified servant to a boss who doesn't even know you exist as a human being. Being with you is like dating a spreadsheet. There's no passion. There's no fire. You're just uninteresting." The insult hit me with the force of a physical blow. Uninteresting. Stiff. Cold. I actually staggered backward, my shoulder colliding with the heavy oak shelving unit behind me. A thick manila folder slipped from my numb fingers, scattering glossy documents across the gray carpet, but I couldn't bring myself to care. "Julian, please," I whispered, hating how pathetic, how broken my voice sounded. The sting of tears prickled at the corners of my eyes, blurring the dimly lit rows of shelves. 2 years. You're throwing away 2 years because I'm not spontaneous enough? I love you. I've done everything to support us. And I appreciate it," he sighed, sounding more bored than heartbroken. "But I met someone, Liam. Someone who actually wants to live life, not just schedule it. I'm sorry. I'll come by tomorrow to get the rest of my things while you're at the office. Don't call me back." The line went dead. The sharp, rhythmic beep of the disconnected call echoed in the silent archive room, mocking me. I stood frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear, unable to process the magnitude of what had just happened. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, a single, hot tear spilling over my eyelashes and tracing a burning path down my cheek. I had given him everything. I had exhausted myself, compromising my own happiness to keep his afloat, and in the end, I was just a boring, uninteresting robot to him. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heel of my palm against my forehead, trying to physically force the tears back down. Crying was not an option. Breaking down was not an option. Not here. Not at Vance Enterprises. And especially not when I was the executive assistant to Alexander Vance. I took a deep, trembling breath, slowly lowering my phone and crouching down to gather the scattered documents. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the paper. If a man requires constant entertainment to remain faithful, Liam, he is a boy, not a partner. The voice was low, rich, and darker than a starless night. I froze completely. My heart stopped. The blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. Slowly, terrifyingly, I lifted my head and looked down the narrow aisle of the archive room. Stepping out from the shadows of the adjacent row was Alexander Vance. He was 34 years old, standing at a towering 6'3", dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit that screamed wealth and authority. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his sharp, aristocratic features were usually arranged in a mask of terrifying indifference. In the office, they called him the Machine. He was brilliant, ruthless, and emotionally impenetrable. He was a man who fired executives for being 2 minutes late. He was a man who didn't tolerate personal lives bleeding into company time. And he had just heard everything. Every pathetic, humiliating word of my rejection. I scrambled to my feet so fast I nearly tripped over my own shoes, clutching the manila folder to my chest like a shield. "And Mr. Vance," I stammered, my voice trembling wildly. I didn't know you were down here. I am so sorry. I know this is company time. I was just—" "Breathe, Liam," Alexander interrupted smoothly. He didn't yell. He didn't reprimand me. Instead, he slowly closed the distance between us. With every step he took, the heavy scent of his expensive cologne, bergamot, dark cedarwood, and something uniquely, intoxicatingly him, filled the narrow space, overpowering the smell of old paper. He stopped less than a foot away from me. It was the closest I had ever been to him in my 18 months of employment. Usually, there was a massive mahogany desk separating us. Up close, I could see the startling, intense depth of his piercing blue eyes. They weren't cold right now. They were calculating, piercing, searching my face with an intensity that made my breath hitch in my throat. He reached out. I flinched slightly, expecting him to snatch the folder from my hands. Instead, his long, elegant fingers brushed against my lapel. He adjusted the slight crookedness of my tie, his knuckles grazing the frantic pulse point at the base of my throat. The touch burned through my skin like a brand. "You are many things, Liam," Alexander murmured, his voice dropping to a low, velvety register that sent a violent shiver down my spine. "You are meticulous. You are resilient. You possess a mind that outpaces men twice your age." He paused, his thumb lightly sweeping over the silk of my tie, his eyes flicking up to lock onto mine. "You are certainly not uninteresting, and you are far too intelligent to shed tears over someone who lacks the vision to see your worth." I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. My brain had completely short-circuited. Alexander Vance, the man who barely looked at anyone, the man who was infamous for his lack of empathy, was standing inches away from me, comforting me. "Fix your face," he said softly, stepping back and instantly returning to his commanding, authoritative posture. "I expect those documents on my desk in 5 minutes. And cancel my lunch meeting with the board. You and I are eating in my office today." Before I could even process the command, he turned on his heel and strode out of the archive room, his footsteps echoing against the polished concrete floor until they faded away completely. I stood there in the silence, my chest rising and falling rapidly. My tears had completely stopped, replaced by a sudden, dizzying rush of adrenaline. I touched the spot on my tie where his fingers had rested, my skin still tingling from the brief contact. For a year and a half, I had been an invisible ghost to him, a hyper-efficient machine working in the background of his empire. But just now, in the shadows of the archive room, the way Alexander Vance looked at me, it wasn't the look of a boss examining an employee. It was the look of a predator who had finally decided to step out of the dark. End of Part 1. Part 2, The Cost of an Investment. The elevator ride from the archive basement to the 40th floor took exactly 42 seconds. I knew this because I had counted it every single day for 18 months. Today, however, those 42 seconds felt like an eternity suspended in a vacuum. My reflection in the polished steel doors of the elevator looked entirely foreign to me. My eyes were slightly red-rimmed, a betraying sign of the humiliation I had just endured down in the archives, but my posture was rigid. The spot on my collarbone where Alexander Vance's knuckles had grazed against my skin felt like it was still burning, radiating a strange, terrifying heat through my chest. He had heard everything. The most powerful man in New York, a billionaire who fired senior executives without batting an eye, had stood in the dusty shadows of a basement and listened to my ex-boyfriend call me a boring, scheduled, uninteresting robot. And instead of dismissing me, instead of firing me for bringing personal drama into his immaculate corporate empire, he had touched me. He had looked at me with eyes that promised something far more dangerous than unemployment. With a soft, melodic ping, the elevator doors slid open, revealing the pristine, glass-walled expanse of the executive suite. I gripped the manila folder so tightly my knuckles turned white and stepped out onto the thick, sound-absorbing carpet. The bullpen was a hive of controlled chaos, as usual, but the moment I stepped behind my sleek, curved desk station directly outside Alexander's double mahogany doors, the reality of my job crashed back into me. I had instructions. I immediately picked up my desk phone, dialing the head of the board of directors. "Richard," I said, forcing my voice into the crisp, emotionless tone I reserved for company business. "Mr. Vance sends his regrets, but he will be canceling today's 1 p.m. lunch meeting. A pressing matter has required his immediate attention." "Canceling?" Richard's voice crackled through the receiver, thick with disbelief. "Liam, we've had this on the books for 3 months. The merger." "Mr. Vance's schedule is not up for debate, Richard," I replied smoothly, echoing the cold authority of my boss. "He will review the preliminary numbers by Friday. I will send you the revised calendar invite. Have a good afternoon." I hung up before the man could argue further. My hands were shaking again. Alexander Vance did not cancel board meetings. He was a machine, a man who optimized every single second of his day for maximum profit and efficiency. The idea that he had cleared his afternoon schedule just because of what he witnessed in the archives was a thought too overwhelming to process. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed down the front of my suit jacket, and approached his imposing doors. I knocked twice, sharp and precise. "Enter," came his voice, deep and resonant, easily cutting through the heavy wood. I pushed the door open and stepped into the cavernous office. It was a space designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline, but the true focal point was the massive desk at the center and the man sitting behind it. Alexander had removed his suit jacket. He was wearing a crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up precisely to his forearms, revealing the taut, corded muscles and the heavy, expensive Rolex on his left wrist. He didn't look up from his tablet as I approached. "Put it on the desk, Liam." I stepped forward, placing the requested merger documents on the dark wood. "The file from 5 years ago, sir. And the board meeting has been successfully canceled." "Good." Alexander set his stylus down. Slowly, he leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. His piercing blue eyes lifted, locking onto mine with an intensity that made the air in the room feel instantly heavier. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just watched me, tracking the subtle, nervous rise and fall of my chest. Under his intense scrutiny, I felt incredibly exposed. It was as if he were cataloging every flaw, every crack in my professional armor. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the plush leather chair opposite his desk. "Sir, I have to prep the afternoon briefings." I said sit, Liam. It wasn't a request. The dangerous silkiness in his tone left absolutely no room for negotiation. I swallowed hard and sat down, keeping my spine perfectly straight and my hands folded tightly in my lap. The silence stretched between us, thick and vibrating with an unspoken tension. I was used to silence with Alexander, but it was usually the silence of two people working efficiently in proximity. This was different. This was predatory. A soft knock on the door broke the heavy atmosphere. "Come in," Alexander called out. It was Maria, one of the junior assistants from the lobby, looking utterly terrified as she wheeled in a silver service cart. The lunch you ordered from the concierge, Mr. Vance," she stammered, avoiding eye contact with him completely. "Leave it," he dismissed her without a glance. Maria practically fled the room. Alexander stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the office, and walked over to the cart. He removed the silver cloche covers, and the rich, savory smell of garlic, roasted tomatoes, and fresh basil immediately flooded the room. I stared in shock. It wasn't the Michelin-starred catering Alexander usually demanded. It was 2 massive portions of chicken parmesan from Luigi's, a tiny, hole-in-the-wall Italian deli located 5 blocks away. It was cheap, messy, and absolutely phenomenal. It was also my favorite food in the entire city. I went there every Friday when I actually had a spare 30 minutes to take a real lunch break. Alexander carried the plates over, setting one directly in front of me, along with a stack of linen napkins. He then returned to his own chair with his plate, picked up his fork, and looked at me. "Eat," he instructed. "How?" My voice barely worked. I stared at the steaming pasta, then up at my terrifying billionaire boss. "How did you know about this place?" "I know everything that happens in my building, and I know everything about the people who ensure my life runs smoothly," Alexander said casually, taking a slow, deliberate bite of his food. "You go to Luigi's on Fridays at exactly 1:15 p.m. You order the chicken parmesan, extra sauce, and you sit at the corner table by the window to read financial thrillers while you eat. You are a creature of habit, Liam." My heart hammered against my ribs. He had noticed. Alexander Vance, a man who couldn't even remember the names of his own vice presidents, knew my lunch schedule. He knew where I sat. He knew what I read. I didn't realize you paid that much attention, sir," I managed to say, picking up my fork with trembling fingers. "I pay attention to my most valuable assets," Alexander replied, his blue eyes darkening as they tracked the movement of my hands. "And for the last 18 months, you have been the most valuable asset in this entire company. You anticipate my needs before I articulate them. You manage my chaos with flawless precision. You do not panic, you do not falter, and you do not break." He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk. The physical distance between us felt dangerously small. "So, you can imagine my immense displeasure when I walked into the archives today to find my most pristine, resilient assistant being broken down by a man who sounds like he lacks the intellectual capacity to tie his own shoes." I flinched slightly at the mention of Julian, my gaze dropping to my plate. "It was a personal matter, Mr. Vance. It won't affect my work. I apologize for letting you see that." "Stop apologizing," Alexander snapped, the sudden harshness in his voice making me jump. But when I looked up, his expression wasn't angry. It was fiercely protective. "You have nothing to apologize for. Loyalty, Liam, is a rare currency. You gave yours to a terrible investment. That is a flaw in his character, not yours." He said I was like dating a spreadsheet, I whispered, the humiliating words slipping out before I could stop them. I hated how vulnerable I sounded, but the smell of the food, the surreal nature of the conversation, and the heavy, intoxicating presence of Alexander were stripping away my defenses. He said I was cold, that I had no passion. A low, dark chuckle rumbled from Alexander's chest. It was a sound I had never heard before, rich, dangerous, and dripping with pure arrogance. "Cold," Alexander repeated softly, his eyes dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before meeting my gaze again. "No, you are not cold, Liam. You are controlled. There is a very significant difference." He set his fork down and folded his hands beneath his chin, studying me with a terrifyingly clinical intensity. "People like your ex-boyfriend are terrified of control because they lack the discipline to achieve it. They want loud, messy, chaotic passion because it requires no real effort. But true passion—" Alexander's voice dropped an octave, the vibrations seeming to settle directly into my bones. "True passion is a slow burn. It is methodical. It is the absolute, unyielding dedication to a singular goal until it is yours. You have that discipline, Liam. I've watched you apply it to your work every single day." I couldn't look away from him. The air in the office felt impossibly thin. My lungs were burning, my mind racing as I tried to decipher the heavy, double meaning layering his words. "He was a fool," Alexander continued, his tone softening just a fraction, though the possessive edge remained razor-sharp. "A blind, reckless fool who held a diamond and complained that it didn't look like glass. I do not tolerate fools, Liam. And I certainly do not tolerate anyone damaging what belongs to my ecosystem." What belongs to my ecosystem? The phrasing was cold, corporate, and yet, coming from him, it felt like the most intimate claim I had ever heard. "Eat your lunch, Liam," Alexander ordered softly, picking up his tablet once again, though his eyes kept darting back to watch me. "You are going to need your energy. I have decided to completely restructure our workflow moving forward. From now on, you will no longer be managing things from outside my doors." I froze, a piece of chicken halfway to my mouth. "Sir, I want your desk moved inside my office," Alexander stated, not looking up from his screen, though I could see the faint, victorious smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Starting tomorrow, you will be working in here. With me." My breath caught. Working in the same room as Alexander Vance. 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours a day, breathing the same air, under the constant, heavy weight of his predatory gaze. There would be no escape. There would be no walls between us. And the most terrifying realization of all washed over me as I took a bite of the lunch he had meticulously planned for me. I didn't want there to be walls. End of Part 2. Part 3. The Intruders and the Empire. By 8 a.m. on Wednesday morning, my entire reality had been physically and psychologically rearranged. When I stepped off the elevator and walked into the executive suite, my old desk in the outer bullpen was completely gone. In its place was a sleek, minimalist sitting area. My pulse began to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I slowly approached the heavy mahogany doors of Alexander Vance's office. I pushed them open, and there it was. Facilities must have worked through the night. A beautiful glass-topped executive desk had been positioned inside the cavernous office. It was situated to the right of Alexander's massive workspace, angled perfectly so that if he simply lifted his eyes from his monitor, I would be entirely in his line of sight. It was a strategic, calculated placement. There was no longer a wall between us. There was no longer an intercom to act as a buffer. I was now entirely contained within his ecosystem. Alexander was already there, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows with a cup of dark coffee in his hand, looking out over the sprawling concrete grid of Manhattan. He didn't turn around when the door clicked shut behind me, but I knew he heard me. He heard everything. "Your new workstation has been configured to your exact specifications, Liam." His voice washed over the quiet room, deep and resonant. "The dual monitors are at the correct height, and I had them bring in the ergonomic chair you had requisitioned 3 months ago, but HR deemed unnecessary for support staff." I swallowed hard, walking over to my new desk. I ran my fingers over the smooth glass. It was perfect. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. I didn't realize you knew about the HR requisition." "I told you yesterday," he said, finally turning to face me. The morning sunlight caught the sharp angles of his jaw and the immaculate tailoring of his navy blue suit. "I pay attention to what is mine. Sit down. We have a board meeting at 10, and I need you to review the quarterly projections. I want your unvarnished opinion on the European markets." The casual way he dropped the phrase "what is mine" made my breath hitch, but I forced myself to nod, taking my seat and booting up the computer. For the next 2 days, the atmosphere inside the office was a masterclass in psychological tension. Working in such close proximity to the man they called the machine was exhausting, but not in the way I had anticipated. It wasn't because of his demands, it was because of his focus. I could feel his blue eyes on me constantly. When I typed, when I paused to rub my temples, when I took a sip of my water, he was watching. It was an intense, simmering surveillance that made my skin flush and my stomach flutter with a dangerous, forbidden heat. He didn't make any overt advances. He didn't cross any professional lines. But the intimacy was in the details. When he ordered his afternoon espresso, a second cup magically appeared on my desk, black, no sugar, exactly how I liked it. When the air conditioning kicked in and I shivered slightly, the temperature in the room was silently adjusted a moment later. He was cataloging me, memorizing my rhythms, and adjusting his empire to accommodate my comfort. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. By Friday afternoon, the tension had reached a boiling point. I was deeply engrossed in a spreadsheet, aggressively typing out formulas, trying to ignore the heavy, magnetic pull of Alexander's presence just a few feet away. The silence was broken by the sharp trill of my direct desk phone. I picked it up automatically. Liam Brooks, executive assistant to Alexander Vance. "Liam, it's Sarah at the front reception." The voice on the other end sounded unusually strained. "I have a situation down here. There is a gentleman named Julian who is demanding to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, and he is becoming extremely disruptive." My blood ran cold. The spreadsheet blurred before my eyes. "Julian." "Sarah, call security," I said, my voice dropping to a frantic whisper, desperately hoping Alexander wouldn't hear me. "Do not let him up to the 40th floor. I will be right down." "Too late, Liam," Sarah said apologetically. He bypassed the main turnstile when a large group came through. "He's already in the elevator bank." Panic clawed at my throat. I slammed the phone down and shot up from my chair. I needed to intercept him before he reached the executive floor. I needed to keep my private, messy life from spilling onto the pristine carpets of Vance Enterprises. Is there a problem, Liam? Alexander's voice cut through the air, sharp as a scalpel. He had stopped typing. His eyes were locked onto my pale face. No, sir. I lied smoothly, grabbing my keycard. Just a minor delivery issue at the reception desk on this floor. I'll be back in exactly 2 minutes. Before he could question me further, I practically ran out of the office, letting the heavy doors shut behind me. I sprinted past the bullpen and rounded the corner into the expansive, marble-floored reception area of the 40th floor. The elevator doors chimed and slid open just as I arrived. Julian stepped out. He looked disheveled, his usual effortless, artistic charm replaced by a dark, ugly scowl. He was wearing a leather jacket and carrying a canvas tote bag. When his eyes locked onto me, his face twisted into a sneer. "There you are," Julian snapped, storming past the terrified receptionist and marching directly into my personal space. "What the hell is your problem, Liam? You changed the locks on the apartment. Keep your voice down," I hissed, looking around frantically. Several junior executives were pausing to stare. "This is my place of work, Julian. You cannot be here. I packed all your things in boxes and left them with the doorman. We have nothing left to discuss." "We have plenty to discuss," Julian barked, stepping closer, his imposing frame trying to intimidate me. "You don't get to just shut me out because your ego got bruised. I came here to tell you that you are acting like a petulant child. You always do this. You shut down. You hide behind your little spreadsheets and your pathetic corporate servitude." "Stop it," I commanded, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and humiliation. "You broke up with me over the phone while I was working. You told me I was boring and uninteresting. You made your choice, Julian. Now get out of my building." "Your building?" Julian let out a cruel, mocking laugh, reaching out and harshly grabbing my upper arm. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into my bicep through the fabric of my suit. "Don't act like you're somebody important, Liam. You're a glorified secretary. You fetch coffee for a man who doesn't even know your last name. You need me. Without me, you have no life." "Let go of me," I ordered, trying to wrench my arm out of his grasp, but he held on stubbornly. "I said we are going to talk. Remove your hand from my assistant, or I will have security break every single one of your fingers." The voice didn't just echo through the marble reception area. It seemed to violently suck all the oxygen out of the room. Julian froze. I gasped, turning my head. Alexander Vance was standing at the edge of the hallway. He looked like an apex predator that had just found a trespasser in his territory. His posture was completely relaxed, his hands tucked elegantly into the pockets of his slacks, but the aura radiating off him was pure, terrifying violence. His blue eyes were practically glowing with a cold, lethal rage, fixated entirely on the hand gripping my arm. The entire floor went dead silent. Phones stopped ringing. People stopped walking. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian, clearly thrown by the sudden arrival of the billionaire, blinked rapidly but stubbornly maintained his grip. "Who the hell are you? This is a private conversation." Alexander didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He took slow, measured steps across the marble floor, his leather shoes clicking ominously with each stride. He stopped mere inches from Julian. Up close, the height difference was glaring. Alexander towered over him, radiating a dark, crushing authority that made Julian subconsciously shrink back. "I am Alexander Vance," he said softly, his voice a deadly, silken threat. "And you are standing on my floor, breathing my air, and putting your hands on something that belongs to me. I will give you exactly 3 seconds to let him go before I ruin your life so thoroughly that you will not be able to find employment in this city ever again." Julian's face went completely white. His hand dropped from my arm as if he had been burned. He stumbled backward, his bravado entirely shattering under the weight of Alexander's freezing glare. I was just 1, Alexander counted, his tone completely flat. "Liam and I have a history," Julian stammered, looking at me for help, but I remained perfectly still, my heart hammering in my throat. 2. Julian didn't wait for 3. He turned on his heel and practically scrambled back into the elevator, frantically mashing the button for the lobby. The doors slid shut, hiding his terrified face from view. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander didn't look at the stunned employees watching the scene. He didn't acknowledge the receptionist. He simply turned to me, his cold eyes softening the moment they met mine. He reached out, his warm, large hand wrapping gently around the exact spot on my arm where Julian had grabbed me. The contrast between Julian's harsh grip and Alexander's firm, protective touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to my core. "Are you injured?" Alexander asked, his voice low, meant only for me. "No," I whispered, staring up into those mesmerizing blue eyes. "I'm fine. I'm sorry for the disruption, sir." "Do not apologize," he commanded softly. His thumb brushed slowly back and forth across the sleeve of my suit jacket, a soothing, possessing motion. "He is gone. He will never step foot within a 5-mile radius of this building again. I will make sure of it." He slowly let go of my arm, gesturing back down the hallway. "Come back to the office, Liam. We have work to do." I followed him back through the bullpen, my mind a swirling chaos of adrenaline and awe. He had defended me. He had claimed me in front of the entire floor. When we finally re-entered his massive office and the heavy doors clicked shut, locking the rest of the world out, the atmosphere shifted entirely. It was thick, charged, and overwhelmingly intimate. I leaned against the glass of my new desk, my legs suddenly feeling weak as the adrenaline crashed. I took a shaky breath, pressing my hands to my face. I heard Alexander's slow footsteps approaching. He didn't go to his desk. He walked directly over to me, stopping so close that the toes of his expensive shoes brushed against mine. "Look at me, Liam," he ordered quietly. I lowered my hands and looked up. He reached out, gently hooking a finger under my chin, tilting my head up so there was no escaping his piercing gaze. "You are not boring. You are not uninteresting," Alexander murmured, his face inches from mine, his breath warm against my lips. "You are brilliant, and you are safe here. Do you understand me?" "Yes," I breathed out, my eyes locked on his mouth, utterly trapped in his gravity. "I understand." A slow, devastating smirk played at the corner of Alexander's lips. His thumb brushed against my lower lip, a touch so fleeting it almost wasn't there, leaving me completely breathless and aching for more. "Good," he whispered. "Now pull up the European projections. We have an empire to run." End of Part 3. Part 4. The Bespoke Armor. The weekend following Julian's disastrous intrusion passed in an agonizing blur of nervous, restless energy. I spent 48 hours in my apartment pacing the hardwood floors, unable to concentrate on a single book, movie, or chore. Every time I closed my eyes, I didn't see the shattered pieces of my 2-year relationship. Instead, all I saw was the terrifying, beautiful fury in Alexander Vance's piercing blue eyes. I felt the phantom weight of his hand wrapped protectively around my arm. I heard the dark, silken promise in his voice declaring to the entire 40th floor that I belonged to his ecosystem. By the time Monday morning arrived, the atmosphere at Vance Enterprises had shifted. The corporate gossip mill was undoubtedly operating at maximum capacity, whispering about the billionaire CEO who had nearly broken a man's arm to protect his executive assistant. But no one dared breathe a word of it aloud. The fear of Alexander's wrath was far more potent than the allure of office rumors. When I stepped into his cavernous office and took my seat at the new glass desk, the outside world ceased to exist. We were sealed in our own immaculate, temperature-controlled bubble. For the first half of the week, the tension between us was a living, breathing entity. Alexander was entirely professional when discussing profit margins and global supply chains, but the moment the work paused, the air grew heavy. He watched me with an unyielding, predatory focus. He noticed when I skipped a coffee break and silently placed a fresh espresso on my desk. He noticed when I rubbed the back of my neck after hours of staring at a screen, and suddenly, the ambient lighting in the room would dim to a softer, more forgiving hue. It was a terrifying level of attention, dismantling my defenses piece by piece. I had spent my entire life trying to be invisible, useful, and accommodating. Alexander was forcing me to be seen. On Wednesday afternoon, the quiet hum of the office was shattered when Alexander abruptly closed his laptop and leaned back in his leather chair. "Liam," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a perfectly sharpened blade. I immediately sat up straight, my fingers freezing over the keyboard. "Yes, sir?" The annual Vance Foundation Gala is this Saturday evening. It is the most significant philanthropic event my company hosts. The governor will be there, along with the board of directors and our top-tier international investors. I nodded quickly, mentally scanning his schedule. "Yes, I have the itineraries finalized. I've coordinated with the PR department. Vice President Reynolds is set to accompany you, and I have arranged for the company car to pick you up at." "Cancel Reynolds," Alexander interrupted smoothly, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. She will attend with her husband. You will be accompanying me. My heart physically stalled in my chest. I stared at him, certain I had misheard. Sir? I am the executive assistant. I manage the event logistics from the shadows. I coordinate the catering staff, the press passes, the security. My security team is more than capable of handling the perimeter, and the catering staff does not require a babysitter, Alexander stated, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. You are not going to be managing anything from the shadows on Saturday, Liam. You will be walking through the front doors, on my arm, as my plus one. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. Attending the gala was one thing. Attending as the personal guest of Alexander Vance was a declaration. It was public. It was a shattering of the professional boundaries we had always maintained. The board would see. The press would see. Mr. Vance, I stammered, my palms suddenly slick with sweat. I cannot. I don't have the proper attire for an event of that magnitude. It's a white tie affair. I own a standard black tuxedo from a department store. I will look completely out of place standing next to you. It will reflect poorly on the company. A slow, dangerously captivating smirk curved the edges of Alexander's mouth. He stood up, slowly unbuttoning his suit jacket as he walked around his massive mahogany desk, closing the distance between us until he was standing directly in front of my workstation. You could wear a burlap sack, Liam, and you would still be the most breathtaking creature in any room you walk into, he murmured, his voice dropping to that intimate, vibrating register that made my toes curl in my shoes. But I have absolutely no intention of letting you wear a department store tuxedo. Before I could process the compliment, the heavy office doors swung open. I jumped, spinning around in my chair. A sharply dressed older man carrying a leather measuring tape draped around his neck stepped into the room, followed by two assistants carrying massive swatches of luxurious fabrics. Ah, exactly on time, Vincenzo, Alexander greeted the man without taking his eyes off me. Liam, stand up. What is this? I asked, my voice barely a whisper as I slowly rose to my feet. This is Vincenzo. He has been my personal tailor for a decade, Alexander explained smoothly, stepping back slightly to give the tailor room, though his gaze remained pinned to me. He is going to construct your armor for Saturday night. Vincenzo approached me with an artist's critical eye, nodding approvingly before circling me like a hawk. A magnificent frame, Mr. Vance, the tailor noted, pulling the tape measure taut. Broad shoulders, narrow waist. Very elegant. We will need to accentuate the line of the spine. I stood frozen in the center of the office, feeling my face burn violently as Vincenzo's assistants began taking rapid measurements. They measured my arms, the breadth of my chest, the circumference of my throat. Every time the tape measure pulled tight across my body, my eyes involuntarily darted to Alexander. He was leaning against the edge of his desk, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the entire process with a dark, consuming intensity. He was examining me not as a boss looking at an employee, but as a man entirely obsessed with a masterpiece he was commissioning. The fabric, sir? Vincenzo asked, holding up a swatch of traditional black wool. No. Alexander rejected it instantly. He stepped forward, his tall frame looming over the tailor. He reached into the pile of swatches and pulled out a stunning, deep midnight blue velvet. It was rich, opulent, and incredibly daring. This one, it will contrast perfectly with my standard black, and it will draw out the silver tones in his eyes, and line the interior with black silk. Vincenzo smiled. An exquisite choice. Now the inseam. I stiffened entirely as the tailor knelt down, the tape measure gliding up the inside of my leg. It was an entirely standard tailoring procedure, but under the heavy, scorching weight of Alexander's gaze, the action felt dangerously intimate. My breath hitched, a small, involuntary gasp escaping my lips. Alexander's eyes snapped to my face, darkening instantly. He stepped forward, his jaw clenching. That's enough, Vincenzo, he commanded sharply, his voice laced with a sudden, possessive edge. You have the measurements you need. Have it finished and delivered to his apartment by Friday evening. Of course, Mr. Vance, Vincenzo agreed quickly, clearly sensing the sudden, dangerous shift in the billionaire's mood. The tailor and his assistants packed up their materials with lightning speed and hurried out of the office, leaving me alone with Alexander once again. The silence rushed back in, thicker and hotter than before. Alexander took a slow step toward me. I couldn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain he could hear it. He stopped right in front of me, lifting his hand. The back of his knuckles brushed lightly against my cheek, a touch so incredibly gentle it made my breath shatter in my throat. "You are going to be spectacular, Liam," he whispered, his blue eyes searching mine for any sign of fear. Finding none, his thumb traced the line of my jaw. "And everyone in that room is going to know exactly who you are with." Friday evening arrived with the force of a freight train. I stood in the center of my small bedroom, staring at my reflection in the full-length mirror, unable to recognize the man looking back at me. Vincenzo had outdone himself. The midnight blue velvet tuxedo jacket fit me like a second skin, tailoring perfectly to my shoulders and tapering sharply at my waist. The black silk lapels caught the dim light of my apartment, giving the ensemble a dangerous, devastating elegance. The trousers were immaculate, falling perfectly over the polished black dress shoes Alexander had sent along with the suit. I looked powerful. I looked expensive. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A single text message from Alexander. "I am downstairs." I took a deep, shuddering breath, grabbed my keys, and headed out. The crisp autumn air hit my face as I walked out of my building. A sleek, black Maybach was idling at the curb. The rear door was already open. Alexander was waiting inside. I slid into the plush leather seat, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. As the door pulled shut, sealing us in the luxurious, soundproof interior of the car, I finally turned to look at him. He was wearing a classic, immaculate black tuxedo that made him look like a lethal, modern-day king. But he wasn't looking at my face. His eyes were slowly dragging up and down my body, taking in the midnight blue velvet, the crisp white shirt, the perfect line of the trousers. For the first time since I had met him, Alexander Vance looked entirely, utterly speechless. "Mr. Vance," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly under the weight of his stare. He slowly lifted his eyes to meet mine. The hunger in his expression was no longer hidden. It was raw, unmasked, and terrifyingly beautiful. "Alexander," he corrected softly, shifting his large frame closer to me on the leather seat. The scent of bergamot and cedar completely enveloped me. "Tonight, you call me Alexander." He reached across the space between us, his large hand gently wrapping around my own. His long fingers intertwined with mine, his grip firm, warm, and entirely possessing. He didn't let go as the car pulled away from the curb, speeding toward the gala. "Tonight, Liam," Alexander murmured, his thumb slowly stroking the back of my hand, sending violent shivers straight to my core. "Everything changes." End of Part 4. Part 5, the center of the room. The Maybach glided to a seamless halt, but my heart was racing so fast I could barely hear the purr of the engine. Through the tinted glass, the world outside was a chaotic ocean of flashing camera bulbs, velvet ropes, and elite socialites draped in diamonds. The Vance Foundation Gala was the social event of the season, a playground for the billionaire class. And I was about to step into it, not carrying a clipboard or a headset, but holding the hand of the most powerful man in the city. Alexander didn't immediately move to exit the vehicle. Instead, he sat perfectly still in the dim, luxurious interior, his thumb continuing its slow, hypnotic stroke across the back of my hand. The quiet possessiveness of the gesture was the only thing anchoring me to gravity. "Breathe, Liam," Alexander murmured, his voice a dark, soothing rumble that vibrated against my skin. "They're going to look at you. Let them. You have absolutely no reason to hide." "I'm an assistant, Alexander," I whispered, the use of his first name feeling like a dangerous, forbidden luxury on my tongue. "They know who I am. The board members, the investors, they see me fetch your coffee. Walking in there with you, it's going to cause a scandal." "Let it," he replied instantly, his blue eyes flashing with a predatory, unapologetic arrogance. "I built this empire, Liam. I do not answer to the board regarding who I choose to stand beside me. Tonight, you are not fetching coffee. Tonight, you are mine." Before I could even process the absolute certainty in his claim, the chauffeur opened Alexander's door. The deafening roar of the press corps instantly flooded the car. Alexander stepped out first, effortlessly commanding the attention of every single lens. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket with a casual elegance, ignoring the shouted questions from the paparazzi. Then, he turned back to the open door and held out his hand. I took a deep, shuddering breath, placed my hand in his, and stepped out into the blinding crossfire of the flashbulbs. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the line of photographers and waiting guests. The midnight blue velvet of my Vincenzo tuxedo caught the harsh lighting, making the deep color practically glow against the sea of standard black suits. But it wasn't just the clothes that shocked them. It was the way Alexander Vance was treating me. He didn't drop my hand once I was out of the car. Instead, he shifted his grip, placing his large, warm palm firmly flat against the small of my back, guiding me forward with a touch that screamed ownership to anyone watching. "Keep your eyes forward," he instructed softly, his breath brushing the shell of my ear as we walked up the crimson carpet. "You own the space you walk in." We entered the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, and the sheer opulence of the room briefly stole my breath. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a golden, liquid light over the crowd. Champagne flowed from towering glass pyramids, and a live orchestra played a sweeping, dramatic waltz in the corner. But the moment we stepped through the gilded double doors, the ambient chatter of the room noticeably dropped. Heads turned. Whispers ignited like dry brush catching fire. I could feel the weight of hundreds of calculating, judgmental eyes raking over us. I recognized CEOs I had drafted emails to, politicians whose campaigns Vance Enterprises funded, and the entire executive board. My spine stiffened, the old instinct to shrink back into the shadows flaring up. But Alexander's hand on my lower back was an unyielding wall of iron. He didn't let me retreat. He pushed me gently, inevitably forward, right into the center of the room. "Alexander," a voice called out, cutting through the murmurs. I suppressed a groan. It was Richard Sterling, the senior board member I had hung up on earlier in the week. Richard approached us with a pair of sleek, silver-haired investors flanking him. His eyes darted from Alexander to me, his brow furrowing in a mixture of confusion and thinly veiled condescension. "Good evening, Richard," Alexander said, his tone perfectly polite but carrying an undercurrent of absolute ice. "A magnificent event, as always," Richard said smoothly, though his gaze lingered critically on my velvet jacket. "Though I must admit, I am surprised by your choice of company this evening. Mr. Brooks, isn't it? I wasn't aware support staff were granted invitations to the gala." The insult was wrapped in corporate politeness, but it was designed to humiliate me, to remind me of my place. A week ago, I would have lowered my eyes, apologized for the intrusion, and found a corner to hide in. But as I stood there, feeling the heat of Alexander's hand on my spine, I remembered Julian's voice in the archive room. "You're a glorified servant." A sudden, sharp spark of defiance ignited in my chest. "I assure you, Richard, my presence here is highly calculated," I said, my voice cutting through the air, crisp, clear, and perfectly steady. I met the senior board member's eyes without flinching. "Just as calculated as your department's heavy investments in the offshore tech sector. Though, considering the impending regulatory changes in the European markets next quarter, I would spend less time worrying about the guest list and more time restructuring your portfolio before you have to explain a 12% loss to the shareholders." The silence that followed my statement was absolute. The two investors flanking Richard exchanged alarmed, nervous glances. Richard's face flushed a deep, mottled red, his mouth opening and closing like a fish completely devoid of water. Beside me, I felt a low, vibrating rumble emanate from Alexander's chest. It was a dark, genuine laugh. "My partner speaks the truth, Richard," Alexander said smoothly, the word partner dropping like a bomb into the conversation. He looked at me, his blue eyes practically burning with dark, immense pride. I would heed his advice. His projections are never wrong. Alexander didn't wait for Richard to recover. He applied a gentle pressure to my back, steering me away from the sputtering board member and toward the edge of the dance floor. My heart was hammering so violently against my ribs, I thought it might shatter them. I had just publicly dressed down a senior executive. I shouldn't have done that. I breathed out, my hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline peaked. I overstepped. "You did exactly what I brought you here to do," Alexander corrected, turning to face me. The orchestra had shifted to a slower, more intimate piece of music. "You showed them your teeth. You showed them your brilliant, beautiful mind. You are not a servant, Liam. Stop letting lesser men convince you that you are." He stepped into my space, completely ignoring the hundreds of people watching us. He raised his left hand, offering it to me, while his right hand settled firmly on my waist. "Dance with me," he commanded softly. "Alexander, I don't know how to waltz," I whispered, panic flaring in my chest. "And two men, the press." "I do not care about the press, and I will lead," he replied, his gaze so intense it felt like physical gravity. "Put your hand on my shoulder, Liam." Look only at me. I couldn't refuse him. I didn't want to. I placed my trembling hand on the broad, muscular expanse of his shoulder, letting my other hand slide into his. He pulled me flush against his chest, eliminating the remaining space between us. The moment we began to move, the rest of the ballroom ceased to exist. Alexander moved with the same terrifying, flawless precision he applied to his business. He swept me across the polished marble floor, his grip on my waist secure and possessing. The scent of his bergamot cologne wrapped around me, intoxicating and overwhelming. With every turn, my thigh brushed against his, sending electric shocks straight to my core. "You are magnificent," Alexander murmured, his lips brushing against my temple as he pulled me closer. "I have watched you for 18 months. I have watched you dull your light to make other people comfortable. I hated it. I hated the man who made you think you were ordinary. Why didn't you say anything?" I breathed, my eyes locked onto his, completely lost in the stormy blue depths. "Because you were my employee, and I pride myself on my discipline," Alexander confessed, his voice rough, stripped of its usual corporate polish. "But when I heard him breaking you, my discipline evaporated. I do not want to be your boss anymore, Liam. I want everything." The air in the ballroom felt impossibly thin. The heat radiating between us was suffocating. Alexander's eyes dropped to my lips, the hunger in his expression so raw and devastating it made my knees weak. "The terrace," he ordered suddenly, his voice tight. He didn't wait for my response. He laced his fingers through mine and pulled me off the dance floor, leading me through the crowd and out a set of heavy glass doors onto a massive, secluded balcony. The cool autumn air hit my flushed skin, but it did nothing to douse the fire raging in my veins. The balcony overlooked the glittering expanse of Central Park, completely isolated from the prying eyes of the gala inside. Before the heavy glass doors even fully clicked shut, Alexander spun me around. He backed me up against the stone balustrade, trapping me between the cool marble and the hard, unyielding heat of his body. "You called me Alexander," he whispered, his hands coming up to frame my face, his thumbs tracing the sharp lines of my cheekbones. "Alexander," I repeated, the name tearing out of my throat like a desperate plea. A low growl vibrated in his chest. He didn't hesitate for another second. He leaned down and captured my mouth in a kiss that absolutely shattered my entire world. It wasn't a gentle, testing kiss. It was a claim. It was months of repressed, burning obsession finally breaking loose. His lips were demanding, hot, and tasting of expensive champagne and raw desire. One of his hands tangled in my hair, pulling my head back to deepen the angle, while his other arm wrapped securely around my waist, lifting me slightly onto my toes to press my body flush against his. A soft, desperate sound escaped my throat, and I opened my mouth to him. The kiss deepened, becoming frantic, intoxicating, and completely consuming. I grabbed the lapels of his immaculate tuxedo, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing left on earth. Every touch, every slide of his tongue, systematically erased the memory of Julian, replacing it with the searing, terrifying reality of the billionaire holding me. When he finally pulled back, we were both gasping for air. His forehead rested against mine, his chest heaving, his blue eyes dark and blown wide with need. "You are not boring, Liam," Alexander rasped, his thumb brushing over my swollen lower lip. "You are my absolute ruin, and I am never letting you go." End of Part 5. Part 6, The Architecture of Power. My lips were still burning. The cool, crisp autumn air swirling across the secluded terrace of the Pierre Hotel did absolutely nothing to quell the raging inferno in my blood. I stood pinned between the cold marble balustrade and the unyielding, muscular heat of Alexander Vance's body, my chest heaving as I fought to pull oxygen back into my lungs. Alexander didn't step back. He kept his large hands securely framed around my face, his thumbs slowly, reverently tracing the sharp lines of my cheekbones. His piercing blue eyes, usually so cold, so terrifyingly unreadable, were completely blown out with a dark, consuming hunger. "Alexander," I breathed out, the name trembling on my swollen lips. It still felt like a dangerous transgression to say it out loud, a breaking of every corporate rule I had memorized over the last 18 months. "Say it again," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sent a violent shiver cascading down my spine. "I have spent a year and a half listening to you call me sir and Mr. Vance with that perfect, maddeningly professional tone. I want to hear my name on your lips. I need to hear it." "Alexander," I repeated, my hands sliding up the immaculate silk lapels of his tuxedo to grip his shoulders. The sheer reality of the situation was beginning to crash down on me. I was standing on a balcony at the most publicized billionaire gala of the year, having just been thoroughly, breathlessly kissed by the CEO of Vance Enterprises. What are we doing? The press, the board. Richard Sterling is right inside those doors. If they saw us. Let them see, Alexander interrupted, his tone instantly shifting from raw desire to cold, absolute authority. He dropped one hand to my waist, pulling me flush against him so I could feel the hammering of his own heart. You are still thinking like a subordinate, Liam. You are still trying to shrink yourself to avoid their judgment. You do not need to hide from them, because they answer to me, and I answer to no one. He leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the corner of my mouth, effectively silencing the rest of my protests. The only thing you need to concern yourself with tonight is the fact that you are mine. I am claiming you. Fully. Now take a breath, fix your posture, and let us go back inside and remind them exactly whose empire they are standing in. I swallowed hard, the last remnants of my fear evaporating under the sheer heat of his conviction. For 2 years, Julian had made me feel like an insignificant, boring afterthought. In less than a week, Alexander Vance had made me feel like the center of the universe. I nodded. Alexander's lips curved into a dark, victorious smirk. He took my hand, intertwining his long fingers with mine, and led me back through the heavy glass doors into the blinding light of the ballroom. If the room had been whispering before, it was practically vibrating now. The moment we stepped back onto the floor, still holding hands, the orchestra seemed to play a fraction quieter. Hundreds of eyes darted toward us. I kept my chin held high, focusing on the solid, comforting weight of Alexander's grip. We didn't stay long. Alexander expertly navigated us through the crowd, offering nothing more than clipped nods to the billionaires and politicians who tried to intercept him, until we were back in the quiet, soundproof sanctuary of his Maybach. The ride to my apartment was silent, but it was a charged, heavy silence. Alexander's hand never left my thigh, his thumb drawing slow, rhythmic circles against the midnight blue velvet of my trousers. When the car finally pulled up to the curb of my modest building, he turned to me. "I am giving you Sunday to yourself," Alexander stated, though his eyes suggested he hated the very idea of parting with me. "You need time to process tonight. But Monday morning, things will change. I will send the car for you at exactly 6:30 a.m. Do not be late." He pulled me across the console, delivering one last, bruising kiss that left me entirely dazed, before letting me out of the car. Sunday passed in a haze of nervous anticipation. I packed away the Vincenzo tuxedo, feeling like Cinderella staring at the glass slipper, terrified that when the clock struck Monday morning, the magic would vanish and I would just be Liam Brooks, the invisible assistant, once again. But Alexander Vance was not a man of fairy tales. He was a man of calculated, ruthless execution. When Monday morning arrived, the black Maybach was waiting downstairs exactly at 6:30 a.m. The drive to the financial district felt like a march to the front lines. I was wearing my standard gray office suit, my armor, but my stomach was tied in 100 complicated knots. How were we supposed to act? Did I go back to my desk? Did I make his espresso? The elevator doors chimed open on the 40th floor. The bullpen was already buzzing, but the moment I stepped out, a hush fell over the room. The junior analysts, the receptionists, the HR managers, they all stopped and stared. The gossip from Saturday night's gala had clearly hit the corporate grapevine with the force of a hurricane. I kept my eyes straight ahead, marching toward the heavy mahogany doors of the executive suite. I pushed them open and stepped inside. Alexander was standing behind his desk. He wasn't looking at a screen or reviewing a contract. He was waiting for me. "Good morning, Liam," he said, his voice entirely professional, but the possessive fire in his blue eyes betrayed the formal tone. "Good morning, sir," I replied automatically, moving toward the glass desk he had set up for me last week. "Do not sit down," Alexander commanded smoothly. I froze, my hand hovering over the back of my ergonomic chair. "Sir, that is no longer your desk," he stated. He picked up a thick, leather-bound folder from his workspace and walked around the massive mahogany structure, closing the distance between us. "On Saturday night, you flawlessly assessed the European offshore tech sector vulnerabilities in front of 2 senior investors, a vulnerability that Richard Sterling's department completely missed." He stopped in front of me and handed me the leather folder. "Open it," he instructed. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped the heavy cover open. Inside was a contract, printed on premium Vance Enterprises letterhead. I scanned the bold text at the top, my breath catching in my throat. Promotion of employment. Vice President of Strategic Analysis. I stared at the document, my mind struggling to comprehend the words. Alexander, I whispered, glancing up at him in pure shock. This is a senior executive position. This is on the board. I am your assistant. You were my assistant, Alexander corrected, stepping directly into my personal space. You are brilliant, Liam. You have the sharpest analytical mind in this entire building, and I am done watching you hide it behind a calendar and a coffee machine. You understand the markets better than men who have been working here for 3 decades. People are going to talk, I warned, my heart hammering desperately against my ribs. They already are. After the gala, if you promote me to vice president, they will say I slept my way to the top. They will say you gave me this position because of what is happening between us. Alexander's jaw clenched, a flash of pure, lethal anger darkening his eyes. Let them try. I will personally annihilate the career of anyone who dares to question your competence. I am not giving you this position as a favor, Liam. I am giving it to you because you earned it. I am giving it to you because I refuse to let the world believe you are anything less than extraordinary. He reached out, his large hand cupping the side of my neck, his thumb resting over my erratic pulse point. Furthermore, Alexander continued, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble. As long as you were my direct subordinate, the HR policies of this company presented a conflict of interest. As a vice president, you no longer report to the executive assistant pool. You report to the board. Which means, he stepped closer, eliminating the final fraction of space between us. Which means I am no longer violating corporate policy by doing this, he finished, leaning down and pressing his mouth to mine in the middle of the office, in broad daylight. The kiss was fierce, possessive, and incredibly grounding. It wasn't the desperate, adrenaline-fueled kiss on the balcony. It was a deliberate, calculated promise. He had literally restructured his entire corporate empire just to ensure I was protected, both professionally and personally. When he finally pulled away, I was breathless, my fingers tightly gripping the edges of the leather folder. Your new office is down the hall, Alexander murmured, his forehead resting against mine. Corner suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows. I had them stock the mini-fridge with your favorite sparkling water. But do not think for a second that this promotion means I want you far away from me. I expect you in here for a private briefing every single morning. I couldn't help the laugh that bubbled up in my chest. The sheer, terrifying brilliance of the man was overwhelming. He had completely rewritten the rules of our engagement. Is that a corporate mandate, Mr. Vance? I asked, a teasing smile playing on my lips. Alexander's eyes darkened, dropping to my mouth before locking onto my gaze with an intensity that made the air evaporate. That, Liam, is a personal guarantee. Now, sign the contract. We have an empire to run, and Richard Sterling is currently waiting in the boardroom to explain his catastrophic failure regarding the offshore accounts. I want my new VP of Strategic Analysis to be the one who dismantles his portfolio. I looked down at the contract, then back up at the billionaire who had looked past my invisible armor and seen exactly what I was capable of. For the first time in my life, I wasn't scared of the spotlight. I wasn't scared of the pressure. I grabbed the platinum pen from his desk and signed my name. End of Part 6. Part 7, The Boardroom Massacre. The ink on my contract was barely dry, but there was no time to process the monumental shift in my reality. Alexander didn't give me a moment to doubt myself. He picked up his own leather folder, his slate-blue eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, unwavering confidence. Walk with me, Mr. Brooks. It is time to introduce the board to their new vice president. The walk from his executive suite to the main boardroom felt like stepping through a portal. For 18 months, I had walked these halls invisibly. I was the man holding the tablet, the one fetching the black coffee, the silent shadow standing against the back wall taking minutes while the titans of Vance Enterprises debated billions of dollars. Not today. Today, I was walking beside Alexander, matching his long, predatory strides. As we approached the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom, my pulse spiked, a sudden wave of nausea threatening to rise in my throat. I paused for a fraction of a second, my hand hovering near my side. Alexander noticed. He didn't stop walking, but he seamlessly shifted his trajectory, closing the 2 inches of space between us. For exactly 1 second, The back of his hand brushed against mine, a grounding, hidden caress entirely shielded from the glass walls. "Shoulders back, Liam," he murmured, his voice so low it was meant only for my ears. "You know their numbers better than they do. Eviscerate them." The heat from his brief touch sent a shockwave of adrenaline straight to my core, burning away the last of my hesitation. I squared my shoulders, lifting my chin, and walked through the doors right on his heels. The boardroom was a massive, intimidating theater of power. A 20-foot polished mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by 15 senior executives and board members. Richard Sterling was seated near the head of the table, looking incredibly smug, flanked by his 2 junior analysts. When Alexander entered, the room fell silent. Everyone immediately sat up straighter, the ambient chatter dying instantly. I didn't head for the assistant's chair against the wall. I bypassed it entirely. Instead, I pulled out the high-backed leather chair directly to Alexander's right, the seat traditionally reserved for the second-in-command of the corporation. The collective sharp intake of breath around the table was audible. Richard Sterling's smug expression vanished, replaced by a deep, ugly scowl. "Excuse me, Mr. Vance," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I believe your assistant has made a mistake. The support staff seating is against the wall." Alexander didn't even look at Richard. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, taking his seat at the head of the table with the casual grace of a king surveying a lesser kingdom. He adjusted his cuffs, his cold blue eyes finally sweeping over the room. "Mr. Brooks is exactly where he belongs, Richard," Alexander stated, his voice a smooth, lethal drawl that commanded absolute attention. "As of this morning, Liam Brooks is no longer my executive assistant. He is the new vice president of strategic analysis. He will be auditing every single portfolio presented in this room today. I suggest you update your tone accordingly." The silence that followed was deafening. The executives exchanged wildly alarmed glances. A promotion of this magnitude, bypassing every standard corporate ladder, was completely unprecedented. I could feel the hostile, calculating stares boring into the side of my head. They thought I was a joke. They thought I was a pretty pet Alexander had elevated out of sheer favoritism. I folded my hands on the table, keeping my expression entirely neutral, though my heart was beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Show them your teeth," Alexander had said. "Now," Alexander continued, leaning back in his chair, "let us discuss the offshore tech sector. Richard, you requested this meeting to finalize the acquisition of Horizon Technologies. The floor is yours." Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his tie nervously. He stood up, signaling his analysts to project the slides onto the massive screen at the end of the room. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," Richard began, attempting to regain his blustering confidence. "As you can see from our quarterly projections, Horizon Tech is poised for a massive breakthrough in the European market. Their proprietary algorithm is currently undervalued by at least 20%. We are proposing a hostile takeover, acquiring a 51% stake before their third-quarter earnings report goes public. The projected ROI over the next fiscal year is an estimated $400 million. Richard clicked through a series of impressive-looking graphs, heavily utilizing buzzwords and inflated metrics. The rest of the board nodded along, clearly seduced by the massive numbers on the screen. "It's a flawless acquisition strategy," Richard concluded, shooting a smug, challenging glare in my direction. "A solid, aggressive move that requires seasoned executive experience to execute properly." Alexander didn't say a word. He simply turned his head, his piercing gaze locking onto me. He was handing me the executioner's axe. I slowly opened my leather folder. I didn't look at the slides. I didn't need to. I had spent 3 sleepless nights last month analyzing Horizon's deeply buried financial disclosures, just for my own amusement. "A $400 million return," I repeated, my voice calm, clear, and echoing loudly in the quiet room. "A fascinating projection, Richard. However, it relies entirely on a foundation of willfully ignored regulatory data." Richard's face flushed red. "Excuse me? The data is completely sound. My team spent 2 months. Your team spent 2 months looking at the wrong continent," I interrupted sharply, dropping the polite assistant persona entirely. The shift in my tone made several board members physically flinch. I stood up, picking up a laser pointer from the center of the table. "Slide 4, please," I commanded the junior analyst. The boy scrambled to comply, intimidated by the sudden authority in my voice. I aimed the red dot at the cornerstone metric of Richard's presentation. You are projecting European market dominance based on their current algorithm. What you failed to account for, Richard, is the impending passage of the EU Data Privacy Mandate, Article 42, which is scheduled for a vote in exactly 3 weeks. I looked around the table, making eye contact with the silent, stunned executives. Horizon Tech's proprietary algorithm relies on third-party data scraping that will become explicitly illegal the moment that mandate passes, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. If Vance Enterprises acquires a 51% stake today, in 3 weeks, we will be the majority shareholders of a company whose primary product is banned in 14 European countries. Horizon isn't undervalued. They are actively offloading a dying asset. This isn't a $400 million return. It is a billion-dollar liability. The boardroom erupted into chaotic murmurs. Board members frantically began pulling out their phones, desperately searching for the EU mandate I had just cited. Richard stood frozen, all the color draining from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a very expensive suit. That mandate is tied up in committee, Richard stammered, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. It might not pass. It's a calculated risk. We do not gamble billions of dollars on the whims of a parliamentary committee. I shot back, my voice turning to ice. Furthermore, if you look at the subsidiary shell companies Horizon established in the Cayman Islands last month, they are preparing to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy the moment the mandate goes through. They are looking for a sucker to hold the bag. And you, Richard, nearly volunteered us. I turned the laser pointer off and sat back down, folding my hands neatly over my folder. The silence that blanketed the room this time was entirely different. It wasn't hostile. It was terrified. I had just dismantled a senior vice president's magnum opus in less than 3 minutes, saving the company from a catastrophic loss. I glanced to my left. Alexander was leaning back in his chair, his hand covering the lower half of his face, but it couldn't hide the dark, predatory, absolutely feral smirk playing on his lips. He looked like a man who had just watched his favorite weapon detonate perfectly on target. "Richard," Alexander said, dropping his hand, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Clear out your desk. You are officially terminated, effective immediately." "Alexander, please, you can't," Richard panicked, his voice cracking. "Do not speak to me," Alexander snapped, his eyes flashing with lethal danger. "You nearly cost this company $1 billion because you were too arrogant to do your due diligence. Leave my building before I have security throw you onto the pavement." Richard didn't argue. He practically ran from the room, followed closely by his pale, shaking analysts. Alexander stood up, buttoning his jacket. He looked around the table at the remaining board members, who were sitting rigidly in their seats, staring at me with a newfound, profound respect. "If anyone else requires a demonstration of exactly why Liam Brooks is sitting in that chair, feel free to present your portfolios now," Alexander challenged the room. No one moved. No one spoke. "Excellent," Alexander said. Meeting adjourned. "Mr. Brooks, a word in my office." I followed him back down the hallway, the adrenaline crash hitting me so hard my knees felt slightly weak. The moment the heavy mahogany doors of the executive suite clicked shut behind us, locking the world out, the professional tension in the room instantly evaporated. I barely had time to set my folder down on the glass desk before Alexander was there. He didn't say a word. He grabbed me by the lapels of my suit jacket, hauling me flush against his solid, muscular chest, and crashed his mouth down onto mine. The kiss was explosive. It was hungry, desperate, and fueled by the intoxicating high of the power dynamic we had just established. I gasped into his mouth, my hands flying up to grip his shoulders, holding on for dear life as his tongue swept past my lips, tasting of dark coffee and pure dominance. "You were breathtaking," Alexander growled against my mouth, his hands sliding down to grip my waist tightly. "My God, Liam, the way you destroyed him. I have never been more turned on in my entire life." I laughed, a breathless, dizzy sound, as he pressed a trail of hot, open-mouthed kisses down my jaw, directly over my racing pulse. "I was terrified," I confessed, my fingers tangling in the soft hair at the nape of his neck. "You didn't look terrified," Alexander murmured, pulling back just enough to look into my eyes, his own swirling with dark, intense devotion. "You looked like a king. My beautiful, brilliant king. No one in this building will ever look down on you again." He rested his forehead against mine, our breaths mingling in the quiet sanctuary of the office. For the first time in my life, I wasn't an accessory to someone else's ambition. I was an equal. "Come," Alexander whispered softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from my forehead. Let me show you your new office. End of Part 7. Part 8. The Glass Fortress. The walk down the hushed, deeply carpeted corridor of the executive wing felt like a dream sequence. Alexander kept his hand resting firmly on the small of my back, his long fingers pressing a steady, possessive heat through the wool of my suit jacket. Every step we took away from his massive corner suite and toward the opposite end of the floor felt like I was crossing a threshold into an entirely new universe. We stopped in front of a set of heavy, frosted glass double doors. I stared at the brushed gold plaque mounted flawlessly at eye level. Liam Brooks, Vice President of Strategic Analysis. My breath hitched. The reality of it, etched in gleaming metal, finally punched through the adrenaline of the boardroom massacre. For the past 18 months, my name hadn't been anywhere. I was simply the voice on the other end of the intercom, the signature at the bottom of a calendar invite, the invisible hands that kept the machine running. Now, my name was carved into the very architecture of Vance Enterprises. Go ahead, Alexander murmured, his deep voice vibrating against my ear. I reached out with trembling fingers and pushed the doors open. The corner suite was breathtaking. It was nearly as large as Alexander's, boasting panoramic, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed, dizzying view of the Manhattan skyline and the East River. The afternoon sun poured in, catching the dust motes in the air and illuminating a massive, modern desk carved from dark walnut. Sleek leather couches formed a sitting area in the corner, and a state-of-the-art multi-monitor setup was already booted up and waiting for me. Alexander, I breathed, stepping fully into the room, my eyes sweeping over the immaculate details. I noticed the small things immediately. The ergonomic chair was the exact model I preferred. The pens in the crystal holder were the specific, fine-tip German brand I always ordered. And there, tucked discreetly into the custom cabinetry, was a sleek mini-fridge. Open it, Alexander instructed, closing the heavy doors behind us and locking them with a sharp, decisive click. I walked over and pulled the small glass door open. It wasn't just stocked with my favorite brand of sparkling water. On the middle shelf sat a pristine, untouched box of pastries from a tiny bakery in Brooklyn that I had mentioned passingly to him over 6 months ago. I closed the fridge and turned around, my heart swelling with an emotion so massive and overwhelming it threatened to break my ribs. Alexander was standing in the center of the room, his hands tucked elegantly into the pockets of his slacks, watching me with that dark, intense focus that made my blood sing. You planned this, I said, my voice thick with emotion. You didn't just decide to promote me this morning. This office, the plaque, the furniture. This takes weeks to commission. I made the decision the day you sat in my office and flawlessly diagnosed the supply chain failure in our Asian markets while casually eating a chicken parmesan sandwich, Alexander confessed, a slow, devastatingly handsome smile curving his lips. I realized then that keeping you as my assistant was a disservice to my company and a crime against your intellect. I was simply waiting for the right moment to execute the transition. Richard Sterling's arrogance merely expedited the timeline. He took slow, measured steps toward me, his blue eyes darkening with an unmistakable hunger. This is your kingdom now, Liam. You earned every square inch of it. I couldn't hold back anymore. I closed the distance between us, grabbing the lapels of his suit and pulling him down into a searing, desperate kiss. Alexander groaned, a deep, rumbling sound of pure satisfaction, his arms instantly wrapping around my waist to hoist me up. I let out a soft gasp as he backed me up, pressing my spine against the cool glass of the floor-to-ceiling window. Suspended 40 stories above the city, bathed in the golden afternoon light, we devoured each other. It was a kiss fueled by the intoxicating high of absolute power and the deep, anchoring reality of our partnership. My fingers tangled in his perfectly styled hair, ruining it completely, but he didn't care. His mouth was demanding, his tongue sweeping past my lips to claim every inch of me, marking me as his in the center of my new fortress. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless and flushed, Alexander rested his forehead against mine. We have a lot of work to do, he whispered, his thumb tracing the swollen curve of my lower lip. The board is going to be terrified of you. Let them be. You are going to reshape this entire company, Liam. Only if you're standing right there with me, I replied, my hands resting flat against his chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat. Always, Alexander promised. Over the next 2 weeks, the corporate dynamic at Vance Enterprises shifted so violently it gave everyone whiplash. I threw myself into the role of VP of Strategic Analysis with a ruthless, singular focus. I spent my days auditing the remaining portfolios, dismantling inefficient departments, and restructuring our international investments. The board members, who had once viewed me as a glorified secretary, now sat in absolute, terrified silence when I entered a room. They quickly learned that my quiet demeanor was not a sign of weakness, but a mask for a terrifyingly sharp, unforgiving, analytical mind. And Alexander and I, we operated like a perfectly synchronized, lethal machine. During the day, we were the twin titans of the 40th floor. We challenged each other in meetings, our debates sharp and brilliant, pushing the company to unprecedented profit margins. But the moment the sun went down and the heavy doors of his penthouse clicked shut, the corporate armor melted away, leaving only the consuming, desperate passion we had hidden for so long. Life was perfect. It was a flawless, optimized algorithm, which meant, of course, that someone was bound to try and introduce a virus. It happened on a Friday afternoon. Alexander and I were in my office, leaning over the walnut desk to review a massive merger contract, our shoulders brushing intimately. The silence was suddenly shattered by the door flying open without a knock. I snapped my head up, ready to reprimand whoever had dared to interrupt us, but my anger died in my throat. It was Evelyn, the director of public relations. She looked pale, her breathing shallow, clutching a glossy magazine to her chest as if it were a live grenade. "Evelyn," Alexander said, his voice instantly dropping to a dangerous, freezing temperature. "You have exactly 5 seconds to explain why you bypassed my secretary and barged into an executive suite." "I am so sorry, Mr. Vance." "Liam," Evelyn stammered, rushing forward to drop the magazine directly onto the center of the merger contract. "But you needed to see this before it hits the newsstands on Monday. We managed to get an advance copy from a contact at the publishing house." I looked down at the cover of the Manhattan Insider, a notorious high society tabloid known for ruining careers and tearing apart prominent families. My blood ran completely cold. The breath was violently sucked from my lungs. Splashed across the front cover was a massive, grainy photograph of Alexander and me standing on the terrace of the Pierre Hotel Gala. Our faces dangerously close, the intimacy undeniable. And right below it, an inset photo of Julian, looking disheveled, tragic, and heartbroken. The headline screamed in bold, aggressive yellow font, "Billionaire's Toy. How a Secretary Slept His Way to the Boardroom. Ex-Lover Reveals the Dark, Twisted Power Play Inside Vance Enterprises." My hands started to shake. I stared at the words, the letters swimming in my vision. Julian. He had gone to the press. He had taken his bruised ego and his desperate need for attention and weaponized our breakup to tear down everything I had just built. "Page 14, Evelyn whispered apologetically. Alexander's expression was an unreadable mask of pure stone. He reached out with steady, terrifyingly calm hands and flipped the magazine open to the article. I couldn't stop myself from reading. Julian Hayes, a struggling freelance photographer, claims his life was ruined when his partner of 2 years, Liam Brooks, abandoned him for the glittering wealth of his billionaire boss. Liam changed, Hayes told the Insider in an exclusive, tearful interview. He became obsessed with power. Alexander Vance used his money and influence to manipulate him, eventually buying Liam's affection with a vice president title he is completely unqualified for. It's disgusting. Vance destroyed our relationship just because he wanted a new plaything. The words felt like physical daggers. The implication was clear, dirty, and designed to maximize humiliation. They were painting me as a gold-digging fraud who traded sexual favors for corporate power, and they were painting Alexander as a predatory, abusive boss who ruined lives for sport. "Alexander," I choked out, a wave of sickening panic crashing over me. The board would read this. The shareholders would read this. It would cause a massive PR scandal. The stock prices would plummet. Everything he had built, his pristine, untouchable reputation, was going to be dragged through the mud because of me. Because of my messy, pathetic past. "I am so sorry." "Oh my God, the board." "Evelyn, leave us," Alexander ordered. His voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It was perfectly, terrifyingly flat. "Sir, we need to draft a press release. We need to formulate a denial." "I said leave us," Alexander repeated, his blue eyes flicking up to pin the PR director to the floor. "Now." Evelyn swallowed hard, nodded frantically, and practically sprinted out of the office, shutting the doors tightly behind her. I stepped back from the desk, wrapping my arms around my own torso, suddenly feeling like the entire glass office was closing in on me. "I'll resign," I said rapidly, my voice cracking under the weight of the panic. "I'll draft a resignation letter right now. We can release a statement saying my promotion was probationary and I stepped down due to personal matters. If I'm gone, the story loses its teeth. I won't let him ruin your company, Alexander. I won't." In a blur of motion, Alexander was around the desk. He grabbed my wrists, pulling my arms away from my chest, and forced me to look at him. The sheer, feral rage radiating from his body was staggering, but it wasn't directed at me. "Do not ever," Alexander snarled, his voice a dark, violent tremor, "threaten to leave me. Do you hear me? You are not resigning. You are not stepping down. You are not shrinking yourself to appease a pathetic insect who went to a tabloid because he couldn't stand the sight of you thriving. But the shareholders. I own the majority shares. I am the board." Alexander cut me off, his grip on my wrists firm and grounding. He lifted one hand to cup my face, his thumb aggressively wiping away a stray tear I hadn't realized had fallen. "Look at me, Liam. I am Alexander Vance. I do not hide, and I do not apologize. They want a story about my power? I will show them exactly how much power I wield." He let go of me and walked back around the desk, picking up his phone. He dialed a number from memory, put it on speaker, and set it next to the tabloid. The phone rang twice before a nervous voice answered. "Marcus Sterling, Vance Legal." "Marcus," Alexander said, his tone chillingly conversational, "I need you to execute a hostile takeover of the Manhattan Insider's parent publishing company. Begin the acquisition immediately. Use our offshore liquidity. I don't care what it costs." There was a stunned silence on the line. "Sir, that's a $300 million media conglomerate. A hostile takeover will take months of legal. I do not want it in months, Marcus. I want it by Monday morning," Alexander commanded, his eyes locked onto mine. "And once the ink is dry and we own the publication, you will fire the entire editorial board. You will shred every printed copy of this weekend's edition, and you will ensure that Julian Hayes is buried in so much defamation litigation that his grandchildren will be paying off the legal fees. Do I make myself clear?" "Crystal clear, Mr. Vance. Initiating the acquisition now." Alexander hung up the phone. He looked down at the magazine, then picked it up and casually tossed it into the stainless steel trash can in the corner of my office. He walked back to me, the feral rage slowly melting back into that deep, consuming devotion that only ever belonged to me. He wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me securely against his chest. "No one touches my empire, Liam," Alexander whispered, pressing a kiss to my temple. "And no one touches my king. On Monday, we will give an exclusive interview to the Wall Street Journal. We will sit side by side, we will announce our partnership to the world, and you will detail exactly how you saved this company $1 billion in your first week as vice president." I let out a shaky breath, burying my face in the crook of his neck, breathing in the scent of bergamot and absolute security. The fear evaporated, completely obliterated by the sheer, undeniable force of his love. Julian had tried to break me, but all he had done was unleash a monster who would gladly burn the world to the ground to keep me warm. "Okay," I whispered against his skin, my arms wrapping tightly around his broad shoulders. "We tell the world." End of Part 8. Part 9, The Wall Street Gambit. The weekend that followed was a terrifying, awe-inspiring masterclass in billionaire warfare. From the isolated sanctuary of Alexander's sprawling Tribeca penthouse, I watched the most powerful man in New York systematically dismantle a media empire. Alexander didn't yell. He didn't pace. He sat at the sleek marble island in his kitchen, wearing a simple black t-shirt and sweatpants, sipping espresso as he calmly directed an army of corporate lawyers over the phone. By Saturday evening, Vance Enterprises had officially acquired the parent company of the Manhattan Insider. By Sunday morning, the publication's editor-in-chief was fired. The entire weekend print run was incinerated before it ever reached the newsstands, and Julian Hayes was slapped with a defamation lawsuit so astronomically massive it effectively froze every bank account he had ever touched. It was absolute, unapologetic annihilation. And watching Alexander wield his power with such lethal precision, all to protect my name, ignited a fire inside me that burned hotter than anything I had ever known. When Monday morning arrived, the atmosphere in the penthouse was thick with electric anticipation. Today was the day we controlled the narrative. We weren't just stepping out as CEO and vice president. We were stepping out as a united front, a power couple ready to dare the world to question us. We stood in front of the massive, floor-to-ceiling mirrors in Alexander's dressing room. I was wearing a bespoke slate gray Tom Ford suit that Alexander had commissioned for me, paired with a crisp white shirt and a silver tie that perfectly matched the cold, analytical steel I needed to project today. Alexander stood behind me, dressed in his signature midnight black suit, his broad chest pressed flush against my back as his long fingers deftly adjusted my collar. "Your pulse is racing," Alexander murmured, his lips brushing against the shell of my ear, sending a familiar, thrilling shiver down my spine. "I'm about to give an exclusive, on-the-record interview to the Wall Street Journal alongside a man who just bought a media conglomerate out of spite," I replied, meeting his intense blue eyes in the reflection of the mirror. "I think a slightly elevated heart rate is a reasonable physiological response." A low, dark chuckle vibrated in Alexander's chest. He wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me tighter against him, his chin resting softly on my shoulder. "It wasn't spite, Liam. It was pest control. And you are going to be magnificent today. You don't need to defend yourself. You just need to show them the brilliant, ruthless mind I fell in love with." The words "fell in love with" still made my breath catch, completely paralyzing me with their weight and sincerity. I leaned back into his solid frame, drawing strength from his unyielding presence. "I won't let you down," I promised quietly. "You couldn't if you tried," he replied, turning me around to press a slow, deeply grounding kiss to my lips before stepping back. "Now, let's go remind Wall Street who owns the board." When we arrived at the 40th floor of Vance Enterprises, the bullpen was dead silent, but this time, there was no whispering. The staff parted like the Red Sea, their eyes filled with a mixture of reverence and absolute terror. The rumors of the hostile weekend takeover had clearly saturated the building. They knew exactly what Alexander was capable of, and they knew exactly who he had done it for. We walked side by side into my corner suite. Waiting for us was Eleanor Davies, the most feared Pulitzer-winning financial journalist in the country, accompanied by a small camera crew. Eleanor was a shark in a tailored Chanel suit, known for tearing executives to shreds on live feeds. "Mr. Vance." "Mr. Brooks," Eleanor greeted, her sharp eyes darting between us, clearly trying to read the dynamic. "Thank you for the exclusive." "Have a seat, Eleanor," Alexander instructed, his voice radiating pure, untouchable authority. He didn't sit behind his own desk. Instead, he took a seat on the leather sofa directly beside me, leaving mere inches between us. It was a deliberate, powerful statement of equality. The cameras started rolling. Eleanor didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Vance, the financial sector spent the weekend in a state of shock following your abrupt, aggressive acquisition of Liberty Media Holdings. Many are calling it an erratic move driven by personal vendettas regarding leaked rumors about your relationship with your former assistant. Care to comment?" Alexander didn't flinch. His expression remained a mask of flawless stone. Liberty Media Holdings was severely undervalued due to gross mismanagement of their editorial assets. Vance Enterprises identified a vulnerability and capitalized on it. "We do not engage in erratic moves, Eleanor. We engage in profitable ones. As for the rumors you mentioned, there is no need for back-channel leaks. Liam and I are here to be entirely transparent." Eleanor's eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of a journalist who had just struck gold. She turned her sharp gaze on me. "Mr. Brooks, your rise from the executive assistant pool to the vice president of strategic analysis in a matter of days is unprecedented. Critics argue that you lack the executive experience required for such a critical role, and that your promotion is entirely a result of your newly confirmed romantic involvement with the CEO. How do you respond to allegations that you are unqualified?" My heart hammered against my ribs, but my voice didn't waver. I remembered Richard Sterling's stunned, pale face in the boardroom. I remembered Alexander's hand on the small of my back. "I respond to numbers, Eleanor, not gossip," I said, my voice crisp, cool, and projecting absolute confidence. I leaned forward, looking directly into the camera lens. Experience is often used as a shield for complacency. Last week, executives with 30 years of experience presented a hostile takeover strategy for Horizon Technologies. A strategy that would have cost Vance Enterprises over $1 billion due to their failure to track the EU data privacy mandate, Article 42. Eleanor blinked, slightly taken aback by my aggressive pivot into hard data. You caught the Horizon liability? I didn't just catch it. I dismantled the entire portfolio in under 3 minutes, I stated smoothly. Vance Enterprises requires foresight, not tenure. My ability to anticipate global market fluctuations and regulatory landmines is unparalleled. My promotion was not a gift, Eleanor. It was a necessity to protect the assets of this company from senior executives who had grown lazy. Alexander was watching me, his blue eyes practically glowing with dark, immense pride. Eleanor recovered quickly, shifting her tactics. That is an impressive claim, Mr. Brooks. But the optics of a CEO promoting his partner remain highly controversial. Mr. Vance, doesn't this blur the lines of corporate ethics? How can the board trust that your decisions regarding Mr. Brooks are based on merit and not affection? Alexander's demeanor shifted. The professional ice melted into something terrifyingly intense, dangerous, and unapologetically possessive. He reached out, right in front of the rolling cameras, and placed his large hand firmly over mine, lacing our fingers together on the armrest of the sofa. Let me be absolutely clear, Eleanor, Alexander said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register that demanded total silence. I did not buy Liam Brooks' affection with a title. Liam possesses a once-in-a-generation strategic mind. I promoted him because keeping him as my assistant was a catastrophic waste of his intellect. I secured the most brilliant executive in this country for my board, and I am simply fortunate enough that he also chose to give me his heart. The silence in the room was deafening. The camera operators exchanged wide-eyed looks. It was the most romantic, devastatingly arrogant, and powerful declaration ever recorded in a corporate interview. I built this empire from the ground up, Alexander continued, his thumb slowly stroking the back of my hand, his eyes locked fiercely on the journalist. I own the majority shares. I dictate the future of this company. Liam Brooks is my partner in the boardroom, and he is my partner in life. Anyone who questions his authority questions mine. And I assure you, betting against Vance Enterprises is a losing game. Eleanor Davies actually looked speechless for a fraction of a second before nodding slowly, a genuine look of respect crossing her face. Well, I believe that firmly answers the critics. Thank you both for your time. The moment the cameras cut and the crew packed up to leave, the heavy tension in the room finally broke. I let out a long, shaky exhale, leaning back against the leather sofa. My hands were trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash, but a massive, victorious smile was fighting its way onto my face. Alexander didn't care that the door hadn't even fully closed behind the crew. He grabbed me by the lapels of my Tom Ford suit and pulled me across the cushions, capturing my mouth in a bruising, desperate kiss. I groaned into his mouth, my hands instantly flying up to tangle in his dark hair, kissing him back with every ounce of the fierce, unyielding love I felt for him. You were flawless, Alexander rasped against my lips, his hands gripping my waist with a bruising intensity. When you cited the EU mandate to her face. God, Liam, I wanted to clear the room and take you right on that desk. I laughed breathlessly, resting my forehead against his. You just declared your undying love for me on the cover of the Wall Street Journal, Alexander. The stock prices are either going to skyrocket or we are going to crash the market. The market will bow to us, he murmured, his blue eyes entirely serious. They love a power couple. And that is exactly what we are. The sharp trill of the desk phone interrupted us. I pulled back reluctantly, straightening my tie, and walked over to answer it. Liam Brooks, VP of Strategic Analysis. I answered, unable to keep the pride out of my voice. Mr. Brooks, it's Marcus Sterling from Legal. The voice crackled through the speaker. I apologize for the interruption, but Mr. Vance asked for immediate updates regarding the Hayes litigation. Alexander walked up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and pressing a kiss to the side of my neck. Put him on speaker, Liam. I hit the button. Go ahead, Marcus. The defamation suit has effectively paralyzed Julian Hayes, Marcus reported smoothly. His legal representation dropped him an hour ago when they realized the sheer scope of our evidence against him. He just called my office directly. He is bankrupt, blacklisted from every major photography agency in the city, and he is begging for a settlement. He wants to know what it will take to make the lawsuit go away. I stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking at the sprawling city below. Less than a month ago, I had been crying in a dusty archive room, my heart broken by a man who thought I was boring. Now that same man was utterly ruined, begging for mercy from the empire I helped run. I felt Alexander's chest rumble against my back as he waited for my response. He was giving me the power. He was letting me drop the guillotine. "Tell Mr. Hayes," I said, my voice as cold and smooth as polished glass, "that Vance Enterprises does not settle with people who attempt to sabotage our assets. Tell him he should have appreciated the quiet life when he had it, because now things are going to get very, very exciting for him in court." "Understood, Mr. Brooks. I will inform him that we are proceeding to trial. Have a good afternoon." The line clicked dead. Alexander spun me around, his eyes blazing with a dark, feral obsession. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He simply lifted me off the ground, carrying me toward the heavy oak doors of my office to lock them, shutting out the rest of the world. Julian was gone. The board was conquered. The world knew exactly who I belonged to. And as Alexander laid me back against the leather sofa, the only thing left to conquer was the rest of our lives. End of Part 9. Part 10, The Apex of the Empire. 6 months later, the world looked entirely different from the 40th floor of Vance Enterprises. It looked even better from the apex of the Swiss Alps. The annual Global Economic Summit in Geneva was the ultimate battleground for the world's financial titans. Billionaires, prime ministers, and tech moguls gathered in the sprawling, glass-domed pavilion to negotiate the future of international markets. A year ago, I would have been in the basement of this building, aggressively organizing itineraries, screaming at caterers in broken French, and making sure Alexander's espresso was exactly 160 degrees. Tonight, I was standing in the center of the pavilion, a flute of vintage champagne in my hand, wearing a breathtaking bespoke white silk suit that Vincenzo had spent a month constructing. I was the vice president of strategic analysis, the man who had single-handedly increased Vance Enterprises' international profit margins by 24% in 2 quarters. And more importantly, I was the man who belonged to Alexander Vance. The Wall Street Journal interview had done exactly what Alexander predicted. Instead of a scandal, the market devoured the narrative of the unstoppable power couple. Our stock skyrocketed. The board of directors, now thoroughly purged of Richard Sterling's loyalists, treated my every word as absolute gospel. "Mr. Brooks," a smooth, heavily accented voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned away from the panoramic view of the snow-capped mountains. Approaching me was Jonathan Croft, the CEO of Vanguard Logistics, our biggest European competitor. Croft was a man in his late 50s who reeked of old money, arrogance, and the kind of aggressive misogyny and elitism that usually required a heavy PR team to mask. "Jonathan," I greeted politely, my expression immediately shifting into the neutral, unreadable mask I had perfected over the last 6 months. "A beautiful evening for the summit, isn't it?" Croft chuckled, a condescending sound, stepping slightly too close into my personal space. I didn't back away. I held my ground, my eyes locking coldly onto his. "It is," Croft said, his gaze sweeping over my white suit with a thinly veiled sneer. "Though I must admit, I am continually surprised by Alexander's willingness to let his domestic partner handle international negotiations. It's a very progressive image for Vance Enterprises. But the European markets are not a playground, Liam. They require a seasoned hand, not a former secretary playing dress-up." The insult was deliberate, designed to rattle me while Alexander was across the room speaking with the French Minister of Finance. Croft thought he had found a weak link. He thought the Wall Street Journal interview was just good PR. I took a slow, delicate sip of my champagne, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Croft shift uncomfortably on his feet. "You know, Jonathan," I began, my voice a soft, silken threat that easily cut through the ambient noise of the gala. "I spent a considerable amount of time reviewing Vanguard Logistics' quarterly filings on the flight over here, particularly your heavy reliance on the Mediterranean shipping lanes." Croft's arrogant smile faltered a fraction. "Our shipping lanes are the most secure in the hemisphere." "They were," I corrected smoothly, tilting my head. "Until yesterday morning. You see, Vanguard relies on a fleet of automated cargo vessels manufactured by a subsidiary called Apex Marine. What you failed to realize, Jonathan, is that Apex Marine was quietly acquired by a shell company 3 weeks ago. A shell company entirely owned by Vance Enterprises." All the color instantly drained from Croft's face. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing in silent, horrified shock. "Starting at midnight tonight, the licensing fees for your automated navigation software will increase by 400%, I continued, my voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm. You are going to bleed capital every time one of your ships leaves port. You are going to hemorrhage money until your board forces you to step down, at which point Vance Enterprises will acquire Vanguard Logistics for pennies on the dollar. I stepped forward, entirely invading his space, forcing the older billionaire to physically lean back. I am not a secretary playing dress-up, Jonathan, I whispered, my eyes burning with the cold, calculating fire I had learned from the man I loved. I am the architect of your ruin. Enjoy the champagne. It will be the last vintage you can afford for quite some time. Croft looked like he was going to be physically sick. He didn't say a single word. He turned on his heel and practically fled toward the exit, his hands shaking as he desperately pulled out his phone to call his legal team. I leave you alone for 5 minutes, and you are already dismantling European monopolies. The deep, rumbling voice sent an immediate, violent shiver straight down my spine. I turned around. Alexander was standing a few feet away, holding 2 fresh glasses of champagne. The dark, feral pride radiating from his piercing blue eyes was so intense it was practically combustible. He underestimated me, I said, a slow, victorious smile curving my lips. I merely corrected his data. You eviscerated him, Alexander murmured, closing the distance between us. He handed me a glass and immediately placed his large, warm hand on the small of my back, right over the white silk of my jacket. The possessive weight of his touch grounded me instantly. Watching you tear men like that apart is the most intoxicating thing I have ever witnessed. I learned from the best, I whispered, leaning into his solid, muscular frame. The summit is over for us, Alexander announced suddenly, his eyes darkening as they dropped to my mouth. I have no desire to speak to another politician tonight. Let's go home. Home wasn't New York tonight. Home was a hyper-luxurious, secluded glass chalet perched on the edge of the Alps, accessible only by the private Vance helicopter. The flight was completely silent, the tension between us thick and electric. The moment we stepped through the heavy oak doors of the chalet and the winter storm was locked outside, the professional armor vanished entirely. The living room was illuminated only by the massive stone fireplace, casting a warm, flickering golden glow over the dark leather furniture and the sprawling bearskin rug. The silence of the isolated mountain was deafening, making the sound of our breathing seem incredibly loud in the massive space. Alexander took the champagne glass from my hand, setting it onto the coffee table along with his own. He didn't step back. He reached out, his long fingers carefully unbuttoning my white silk jacket, sliding it off my shoulders and tossing it carelessly onto a chair. Alexander. I breathed, my heart beginning to hammer as his hands moved to my tie, slowly undoing the knot. 6 months, Alexander whispered, his voice incredibly rough, completely stripped of its corporate control. 6 months ago, I walked into an archive room and found my entire world crying over a man who didn't deserve to breathe the same air as you. He pulled the tie free and let it drop to the floor. His large hands moved to frame my face, his thumbs gently sweeping over my cheekbones. His blue eyes, usually so sharp and impenetrable, were completely open, entirely vulnerable, and burning with an absolute, consuming devotion. You think I saved you that day, Liam, Alexander continued, stepping flush against me, his chest rising and falling heavily against mine. The media thinks I elevated you. They have absolutely no idea that it was the other way around. I was a machine before you. I built an empire, but I lived in the dark. You are the only light I have ever known. You are the only thing that makes the air in my lungs feel real. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. I reached up, my hands gripping his strong wrists, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the love pouring from him. Alexander. He didn't let me finish. He took a step back, and my breath physically stopped in my throat as the most powerful, terrifying, and brilliant man in the world slowly lowered himself to one knee on the floor of the chalet. The firelight danced across his sharp, aristocratic features as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, sleek black velvet box. He flipped it open. Resting on the dark satin was a band of pure, brushed platinum, embedded with a row of flawless, channel-set black diamonds. It was modern, powerful, and utterly breathtaking. It wasn't just a ring, it was a crown. I do not want you just as my partner in the boardroom, Liam, Alexander said, his voice ringing with a fierce, unwavering certainty. I want you bound to me. I want your name tied to mine in every conceivable way. I want the world to know that the Vance Empire belongs to you just as much as it belongs to me. Because nothing I have built means a single damn thing if you are not sitting on the throne beside me. He looked up into my eyes, laying his entire soul bare. Marry me, Liam. Rule with me. Let me spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are the most magnificent, brilliant, and deeply loved creature on this earth. A choked sob escaped my lips. The tears I had been holding back finally spilled over, but they weren't tears of humiliation or heartbreak. They were tears of absolute, overwhelming victory. I thought about the man I used to be, the invisible, scheduled, boring assistant hiding in the shadows, desperately trying to be enough for someone who couldn't see my worth. That man was gone. He had been burned away by the consuming, unapologetic fire of Alexander Vance. Yes, I whispered, the word breaking on a sob of pure joy. Yes, Alexander. God, yes. Alexander's face transformed, a blazing, genuine smile of pure relief and triumph lighting up his features. He took my left hand, his fingers trembling just a fraction, and slid the heavy platinum and black diamond band onto my ring finger. It fit perfectly. He stood up, pulling me violently into his chest, and crushed his mouth down onto mine. The kiss was explosive, a searing, desperate collision of souls that tasted of salt, champagne, and forever. I wrapped my arms around his neck, clinging to him, entirely anchored by the unyielding strength of the man holding me. We had conquered the boardrooms. We had crushed our enemies. We had rewritten the rules of power. But as Alexander lifted me off my feet, carrying me toward the massive bed overlooking the snow-covered Alps, I knew the greatest victory wasn't the empire we ruled. It was the fact that we ruled it together. I was Liam Vance, and I was never going to be invisible again. End of story. Wow, just wow. Can we all take a collective deep breath after that ending? Welcome back to reality, everyone. You are tuning in to your BL boyfriend, and if you are anything like me, your heart is still pounding from that absolute roller coaster of a story. Let's just take a few minutes to sit down, unpack, and analyze everything we just witnessed, because there is so much to talk about. First of all, can we talk about Liam's massive character evolution? We started this journey with a man who was literally hiding in a dusty archive room, shrinking himself down and letting a toxic partner convince him that he was boring and uninteresting. He was doing what so many of us do, dimming his own light so someone else could feel comfortable. But the way he transformed into this fierce, untouchable vice president of strategic analysis, the moment he stood up in that boardroom and completely dismantled Richard Sterling's billion-dollar mistake, that was pure, satisfying perfection. He didn't just get handed power. Alexander gave him the platform, but Liam brought the absolute genius. And then, of course, there is Alexander Vance. I mean, seriously, where do we even find a man like this? He is the ultimate definition of, I will burn the world down to keep you warm. Yes, he is this terrifying, ruthless billionaire CEO, but the sheer level of devotion he had for Liam is unmatched. He noticed the little things, the black coffee, the exact pastry he liked, the way he tapped his pen. He completely restructured a global empire just so he could protect Liam and stand by his side as an equal. That proposal in the glass chalet in the Alps, with the black diamond ring? Absolutely breathtaking. And let's not forget the ultimate karma for Julian. Going to a tabloid to ruin Liam's life, only for Alexander to literally buy the entire media conglomerate in a weekend just to fire everyone and bury him in lawsuits? That is the level of petty and protective we absolutely love to see. But enough about what I think. I want to hear from you. We are a family here at your BL boyfriend, and I need to know your thoughts down in the comments. Here are my questions for you. First, what was your absolute favorite moment in the story? Was it the intense balcony kiss at the gala, the boardroom massacre, or that beautiful proposal in the Alps? Second, do you think Julian got what he deserved, or do you think Alexander went too easy on him? And finally, what kind of dynamic do you want to see in our next video? Are we thinking enemies to lovers, fake dating, or maybe a mafia romance? Let me know. If this story made your heart race, please do me a huge favor and smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload from your BL boyfriend. I have so many more thrilling, romantic, and intense stories planned for you guys, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you so much for watching, for listening, and for being the best community on the internet. Stay safe, know your worth, and I will see you in the next story. Bye for now.